Hello and welcome, ladies and gentlemen, this is Battlefield 1. In today's guide, we're going to be talking about elite classes. Specifically, we're going to be covering each elite class separately, what gadgets, tools, and weapons they have available to them, what strengths and weaknesses they have, how you should best play them, and of course, how to best counter them if you find yourself facing an enemy using one of these elite kits. So we're going to go over each class separately, each elite kit separately. Feel free to, by the way, leave down below in the comments any kind of suggestions or additional tips and tricks if I forget to mention anyone in this video. With that being said, let's get straight into the first one we're going to be talking about today, the flamethrower. Now, it obviously has a flamethrower as primary weapon, the Wex, which has a very limited range, and this is the main weakness of the flamethrower. It does, however, have unlimited ammo, can shoot for as long as 15 seconds at a time, or shoot may be the wrong term, but roast, if you so will, for 15 seconds at one time before it's going to require somewhat of a cooldown. You can also, of course, stop firing or triggering some way through those 15 seconds to reset that timer. It's essentially a overheat mechanism similar to what you'd find on some of the larger box magazine LMGs. Another thing you need to note when using the flamethrower, as I'm sure most of you are already aware of, is that there's a trigger delay. Essentially, the flamethrower has to actually ignite the gas it's shooting out. So if you're going to go and try and clear a room, and this is where we start to get, of course, into how to best use this elite class in Battlefield 1, you may want to actually start flaming, burning your flamethrower, shooting your flamethrower, whatever you wish to say, before you actually go in the room. Pre-fire it, essentially, quite in the most literal of terms, before you actually enter that room on Amiens to clear out 3 or 4 guys. Of course, the strength of this weapon, while it's of course very limited to close quarter, is that in close quarter, it really just does roast literally everything in its path. It can do damage even to vehicles, although that isn't, of course, its main purpose. Now, besides this very powerful yet very range-limited primary weapon, the flamethrower comes with 3 incendiary grenades, great when trying to push up onto an objective or trying to take out targets at a little bit more medium range where your flamethrower isn't as useful. Of course, it also allows you to somewhat provide some kind of visual cover for you to move up on. However, you only have 3 of these, so you can get limited use out of that. You also have a melee weapon for close quarter in case somebody tries to get cheeky and starts knifing you. And one of the great benefits of using this class is that you're immune to gas and most fire. Having then covered the basics of it, when using this, well, we've already talked about pre-firing around corner at its very limited range. Another thing to note, and this goes for pretty much any elite class with the exception of course, the newly introduced Trench Raider, is it's relatively dependent on teamwork. If you want to keep this guy going for more than just 2 or 3 minutes, you're going to need a medic that occasionally comes by and actually heals you. Another thing I'd like to point out is use this guy on the correct maps. You don't want to use this guy in kind of open areas, and you can find him on certain maps where there's plenty of open areas not suited to him. Try to stick to buildings and houses and clearing those individual structures. That's the best place to be using a flamethrower in my experience. Of course, the already aforementioned example is Amiens, a great place to be running around with a flamethrower in most situations. Moving on then from its usage to how to best counter it, and we're going to initially cover some general countering techniques that apply to pretty much all elite classes so that we don't have to mention them further on later on, but we'll also of course cover some specific ones designed to counter the flamethrower. Starting off, of course, with the all-popular bayonet charge, an effective way of taking out any elite class. However, it should be warned that applying this bayonet charge or charging the enemy elite class, in the case of the flamethrower, it's even more important than otherwise to do this from behind, because the flamethrower has one of the highest DPSs for actual close quarter, which means as soon as you get in range of his flamethrower, you'll have a decent chance of just dying before you get there, whereas something like, for example, the Sentry with the MG015 will take a little bit longer to actually kill you on a one-on-one in that close of situation. However, the bayonet charge nevertheless is a great way of doing damage to them. Also, and this is specific to this class, keeping your distance. This applies to all classes, but a number of elite classes have decent medium range damage capabilities to the point where if you don't hide, you'll still die. This class does not. Unless he tries to chuck a grenade at you, he's basically screwed at any distance beyond something like 15 meters. So if you just sit 25 meters back from this target with a DMR, an LMG, heck, even an SMG, you can just sit there and slowly whittle them down with your primary ammunition. Because these elite classes will eventually die, they do have a lot of health, but they will quickly go down from sustained fire at a distance. Another thing, of course, and this applies to all elite classes in general, grenades are relatively effective against them. Tanks, planes, and K-bullets. Another great way for the sniper to take out an elite class. If you see an elite class out in the distance and you're a decent shot, you have K-bullets with you, pick up those K-bullets. You're going to do a lot more damage than what you would shooting them once or twice more with your primary ammunition. It's a great way to take out elite classes, especially some of the specific elite classes that rely on sniping, but we'll get into that a little bit later. Having then covered the main source of burnt player flesh in any one Battlefield 1 game, let's move on to the Sentry. And there's 2 versions here, and we're going to talk about both of them. There is the Sentry sentry which comes with the MG0815 and the sentry that comes with the Villa Perosa. Basically, on one given map, you'll find one of these two versions. In the case where there is an Italian faction on the map, you will find the Villa Perosa version. Where there is no Italian faction, you will actually find the MG0815 version. There is an exception to this. This applies to the new They Shall Not Pass operations, where the losing team, instead of getting a behemoth, will get a variety of elite classes. In this case, you'll actually get one of both of these variants. So you'll get one sentry with the MG0815 and one sentry with the Villa Perosa. Speaking then first about the MG0815, this is the more range versatile version of these two weapons. You can use it comfortably at medium range. Nevertheless, your ideal engagement distance is of course close quarter. Given that this is an LMG, it possesses standard LMG qualities, which means it's going to eventually overheat if you just trigger through all the time. In the case of this gun, this is actually at 67 bullets. In other words, you're not going to overheat this weapon too frequently in reality. Another thing you should note is of course that its spread decreases over time while being fired. In other words, hold down the trigger for a couple of shots and then your accuracy will actually be at its best, at its maximum accurate state. Tap firing this weapon is not an effective way to get the most accurate shots out of it. When it comes to the Villa Perosa, this is more close quarter focused. It is essentially two automaticals strapped together with reduced recoil and better hipfire. It's an absolute beast. It's going to melt enemies at close quarters. It can still do damage at medium range, but it's not as good as something like the MG0815 at those medium range targets. Furthermore, note that you're going to be reloading your gun quite significantly, quite constantly if you're using the Villa Perosa, which of course leaves you open for bayonet charges. Just be aware of that. You don't want to get charged mid-reload. Moving on then to the other gadgets or accessories that this class has available to them, because of course other than their primary weapon, they don't differ. They both come with one frag grenade and they also come with a club to melee attack anybody that gets in close quarters. They, much like the flamethrower, don't have a sidearm, which means they have no backup solution. In the case of the MG0815, this isn't really an issue. In the case of flamethrower, it results in a very range limited elite class, and in the case of the Villa Perosa, it means that you're quite vulnerable when reloading your weapon. Moving on then to how best play them. Well, the Villa Perosa is played similarly well as you would play the flamethrower. Get into close quarter, stay in close quarter. Use cover to your advantage, try to avoid open spaces. However, you're a bit more flexible than the flamethrower. On the other hand, you have to reload, and you have that weakness of mid-reload being able to get charged with a bayonet. Another thing you should note is that the sentry class, unlike the flamethrower, is not protected against gas or fire, which means they are very, very effective ways of actually taking out this class. It's not an effective way of taking out the flamethrower because he has a somewhat constant gas mask on. However, not only do the sentries not have their gas mask constantly on, they don't actually own one, which means if you actually throw a gas grenade at a sentry, all they have to do is essentially run away. They can't actually avoid the incoming initial damage, which is usually somewhere around 30 damage, which is a great way to slowly but surely damage down an elite class. Same goes for incendiary grenades. Normal grenades will still do good damage, but they get their usual kind of debuff against sentries, against elite classes. Pretty much as you would expect, you have to take into account when playing this. Try to stay around medics. Healing is once more important. Trying to stay in close quarters, but you're a little bit more liberated, especially when it comes to the MG0815 when actually playing on a conquest operation game mode, regarding which targets and engagements you choose compared to that of a flamethrower. Having covered then the sentry, let's move on to the tank hunter. Now this is the only truly long-range elite class currently in Battlefield 1. And this is of course dictated by its primary weapon, the Tankgewehr M1918, a one-shot all-range against infantry sniper rifle that also does serious damage against armored targets. And this is something I see many people who use this class forgetting. You can do some serious damage against planes as well. In most cases actually up to 33. Essentially you can 3-shot most fighters and attack planes with this class. It's a very, very effective anti-air class as long as you can remain hidden, because once that fighter figures out where you are, you're a relatively easy target, especially because when playing this class, usually you're relatively wide open. But playstyle we'll cover, of course, in just a minute. This class, unlike some of the other elite classes, actually has a secondary. It comes with the sawed-off shotgun, also available to the tanker or pilot class, which means it's quite effective in close quarters. Furthermore, it comes with 2 anti-tank grenades if it has to get close and personal with a tank, as well as a periscope to spot out those longer range enemies or from behind cover. I, in my opinion, don't find that too effective, but I have occasionally used it to somewhat help me out and my team in identifying armored targets out in the distance. Another thing I'd like to mention situation is that you come with quite a few grenades, 3 to 4 frag grenades, and of course your usual club. So how do you play this class? Well, in the ideal situation, you really want to be about 100 meters away from anybody else on the battlefield. You have to go prone or in some form set up your bipod on the weapon to actually use your primary weapon, which in most cases will result in you going prone. Or if you're camping in a house or a window, you can use a ledge there to actually fire your weapon as well. Try to go for armored vehicles first, then go for the necessary kind of fighters and planes flying around, because they are amongst your biggest threats and the ones that you can take down most easily. And then just start one-banging infantry, which is one of the funnest way to actually take out enemy snipers, because they will mistake you usually for a normal infantry player. Hit you with a normal bullet, get something like 15 damage, and you'll then just one-bang body shot them with your ridiculously powerful rifle. Another thing, however, to keep in mind is that you necessarily want to switch up your position as frequently as you possibly can, because if you're lying prone on some sandy hill on Sinai Desert or on some other relatively open map, on operations especially, you'll get flanked by somebody who's then going to come behind you and knife you, and you won't necessarily notice that if you're not paying attention. You can, of course, also go into close quarter with this class. It has a good amount of health, it has a number of grenades available to it, and has a good secondary weapon to deal with close quarter targets in a shotgun. However, you will just simply eventually die in this case, because of course the tank hunter does take quite a bit of damage quite quickly. I don't believe it's actually as resistant to damage as some of the other elite classes out there. I may be wrong, however, this is just my impression. When I go into close quarters with this class, I usually don't last too long. Keep that in mind, you're more effective at long range, but sometimes the necessary situation, game, or in the interest of the team, you of course have to get into close quarters. Once more, medic support will greatly benefit this elite class. Elite classes, pretty much all with the exception of the Trench Raider, heavily benefit from medic play. When it comes to taking them out, there's the usual kind of set of ways to take them out. Grenades, K-bullets are very effective, and of course the bayonet charge. However, there's some additional ways or additional things to consider when taking out this elite class, which makes it more effective or makes it easier to take them out. First and foremost, I like to actually go back to the K-bullets. Given that this class very often is prone somewhere in the distance, you can actually take some pretty good K-bullet headshots on elite classes, and those do some serious damage. K-bullets do good damage, but K-bullet headshots do a lot more damage. This is usually not an option because, well, your sentry kit and your other flamethrowers, etc. are usually moving around. However, this one usually isn't, which means you can do some good damage that way. Furthermore, fighter planes are one of the most effective way of taking out tank hunters, because once more, they're usually prone out in the distance. They're easy targets for fighters not only to spot, but also to take out. This is why I don't understand why tank hunters don't more often go for planes, because they are, of course, one of their main threats. And in close quarters, well, the same thing applies that essentially would for any other of the close quarter focused elite classes, especially something like the Villa Perosa or Flame Trooper. Keep your distance, use your primary weapon, grenade them, and if you can, bayonet charge them. With that being said, of course, let's move on to the last elite class that we're going to be talking about today. And that is, of course, the new one introduced in They Shall Not Pass, the Trench Raider. The Trench Raider is probably one of the more interesting elite classes out there, simply because it relies on a different combat mechanic to take out the majority of its targets. It doesn't use a gun, essentially. It uses, well, a pretty defty looking club to beat your enemies to pulp. This is, of course, the melee class that specializes in quick, one swing, one shot, close quarter takedowns. The animation is shorter than you would necessarily have with other melee weapons, and you will one hit your enemy independent at what angle you're hitting them at, if you so will. It doesn't matter if you hit them in the face with the club, you're still going to go to that kind of one kill slash animation, and you're able to take out quite a few targets in quite a short amount of time. However, what I'd like to note about this is, of course, this class has less health than the other elite classes, or less armor if you so will, and thus is even more subjective to the kind of long range suppressive fire that you can get. But before we get into that, what weapons does the Trench Raider have available to themselves? Well, of course, the Raider Club, this one-hit club for close quarter situations, as well as, of course, a number 3 revolver, giving it a little bit more range flexibility. Nevertheless, revolvers in Battlefield 1 are thought for close quarters. In this case, maybe medium range where you can't quite swing, but it's certainly not going to help you at longer ranges. He also has smoke grenades and an infinite amount of them, which you can chuck out every 10, 15 or so seconds, which are great, and we'll get into that when we talk about how to best play him. And of course, he has 3 frag grenades as well as a medic crate. Now, this is a relatively interesting combination, and the best way to play him really is to get into a close situations. Arguably, the best ones are kind of elaborate bunkers or trench situations where you can use smoke and stay in close quarters all the time without kind of being in dangers of getting mowed down by long range fire. You smoke up the situation and then run around slashing your enemy. all the while constantly putting down your medic crate around you, because you will always be taking damage with this class essentially, because of course you have to be in such close quarters to actually get your kills. What you also want to do is make sure you always take out targets that see you, because if they see you, they'll know that they can bayonet charge you. And this class is probably one of the most susceptible classes to bayonet charges out there. Why? Well, because you don't really have an effective weapon to take them out once they're coming to charge you. The melee club actually hitting at the right time to take them out in the bayonet charge, I don't even know if that's possible. I certainly haven't managed it. And hitting your shot with a revolver is a risky one, because you need two and you usually won't have enough time to place a third shot down if you miss necessarily one of your initial shots. So the best way is, of course, just to club them when you see them and then forget about them. Another thing to note about this is because, of course, people are going to try and bayonet charge you, much like you would with the other classes, but even more importantly, because you're reliant on close quarter with this class, change up your position constantly. Don't stay in the same position. Even if you stay in the same bunker, switch up the corridors or the angle you're hiding in. Always plop down your medic crate as well as your smoke, because, well, it makes you a lot more difficult to actually find, and visibility or lower visibility is in the advantage of you, because you're trying to use a melee weapon. They're trying to actually use guns or bayonet charges, which require much more accuracy than just swinging around frantically. Another thing I'd like to note about this class is that it's self-sufficient. You don't require a medic to actually stay alive with this class. You can heal yourself. Actually, you can also heal other teammates, and I've gotten quite a few points actually healing fellow teammates by just plopping down your medic crate, which is quite funny. And if you actually play a game of Operations on one of the new DLC maps where you usually find this trench raider and you get them in reinforcement, running with something like the sentry with the MG0815 makes for a very lethal combination where you can take care of anything in close quarters, heal both you and your fellow friend using the sentry kit, and he can take care of anything that's kind of at medium range-ish, or at least suppress those trying to fire at you at long range. Now, when it comes to taking out this class, it's actually relatively difficult. If you play this class properly, you stay in close quarters, stay in bunker kind of covery situations, you're going to have a real hard time killing this guy. Bayonet charges are still one of the most effective ways. However, while tanks and planes would be a good way to take them out, on most maps you find this class, not only are they not present, but usually if he's playing the class correct, he shouldn't be exposed to those kind of elements, because he should be in a closed environment protected off from those kinds of forces. So if you see this guy, well, try and chuck grenades at him. That's one of the kind of only things I can suggest. Another way, of course, would be the incendiary grenades. They do same damage on all infantry targets, a great way. This guy can, however, equip a gas mask, so gas is only effective to a limited degree, unlike with the sentry class. I think most people are still trying to figure out how to effectively take this guy out. However, unlike the flamethrower, there isn't quite as many hard counters and ways of specifically dealing with him and reliably taking him out. With that being said, we come to the end of this guide on the elite classes. Feel free to down below in the comments leave any of your experiences with the elite classes. Are you a big user of them, or do you just kind of not bother picking them up in the first place? Have I forgot any important tips and tricks for playing effectively or countering effectively any of the elite classes? Leave that down below as well, of course, with your usual video suggestions. But with all that being said, I'd like to thank you very much for watching and hope to see you in the next Battlefield 1 video.